All right, so hello and welcome back. So we were watching the Armchair Historian. They put out a video recently on the Second Chechen War. Now, this was a war when I was actually technically alive. Um, that happened. I know some of us are younger than me, so maybe you weren't. But this is the Second Chechen War. This is the one. This is the, the one that actually succeeded. Unlike the first one, where Russia got its ass beat. And this is the one that Putin actually took over for when he was president of the Russian Federation. I think this is his first term is when this war happened. So that's a bit of the context. So I know a surprising bit about this, but I'll let him go and we'll see if I add stuff. Again, the original video is in the description. Please subscribe to this channel. Help me get to 1,000 would be very good. And please like the video if you like this stuff. So otherwise, let's go.
Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian. Of all the current world leaders, none seem as incapable of ignoring the international spotlight as Vladimir Putin. From relatively humble beginnings as the third and only surviving son of a naval conscript and factory worker, Putin would climb the ever-shifting power structure of first the Soviet Union and then the Russian Federation, until finally claiming his place as leader of one of the largest, most powerful nations. But Putin's rise to prominence amongst his peers is inextricably linked with the Chechen Wars, a series of conflicts fought over control of the country of Chechnya in the northern Caucasus. In this video, we'll be examining the Second Chechen War and exploring how Putin's careful political schemes exploited the unstable region to both expand the scope of Russian influence and enable his own ascension to the highest office in the nation.
He's also a KGB officer. Before in the Soviet Union, he was a KGB officer, so there's that too. So.
During the chaotic first years of the post-Soviet era, the small and fairly insignificant breakaway Chechen Republic of Ichkeria was mostly left to its own devices, while President Boris Yeltsin struggled to create a viable Russian government and stabilize the economy.
If you have to remember, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a lot of breakaway states. The Russian economy was fucking just basically didn't exist. And a lot of people broke away from the Soviet Union. And the Russians didn't like this, but what could they do? And it's also, this region down here is very important. This is where Baku is. This is where oil from the Soviet Union was. Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Armenia. And then Armenia and Azerbaijan are currently fighting. And that war's probably over by now. And then they fought 2 years ago. So this region is still a hotbed. And Georgia, technically, is where Stalin is from. And this is here in Chechnya in the Caucasus. Now, a little bit of history about this country. This country is This region predominantly, if I remember correctly, especially Chechnya, is predominantly Muslim. Russia is not. Russia is Orthodox. So that's a clash. And a lot of these guys are more tribal affiliated, and it hasn't gone away just because they're in deep mountains. So like you think mountain, can't go past it, so I'm gonna turn around. These people went into the mountains, found a valley, settled, and that's why they have like totally different language structure, if I remember correctly, from everyone else. And they just live in the valleys down here, so they have completely different culture compared to basically Russians.
But Yeltsin always kept the region in the back of his mind, fearing that other Russian republics would use Chechnya's example to make their own bids for freedom. Chechnya was utterly plagued with crime and corruption to such an extent ethnic Russians were leaving in droves, and by November of 1994, Yeltsin authorized the use of disguised military personnel to overthrow the government.
Disguised military personnel.
Then openly resorted to force after this attempt failed. But Yeltsin's hope of a brief, easy intervention were dashed when the poorly coordinated Russian advance on the capital city of Grozny was stalled for days by a motley collection of Chechen troops, volunteers, and foreign mercenaries.
The whole, I could do a whole series on I could do a whole video just on the first war in Chechnya, but basically Ukraine. They decided that driving a single division down they decided to put everyone, see if this sounds familiar. They decided to put everyone in a one road down and they're going to drive to the capital and it's going to be over. Does that sound familiar? It's kind of what they tried in Ukraine. That shit didn't work there, and it didn't work here. So, Second Chechen War, they decided to get their head out their ass and slowly advance along the sector lines with artillery bombardment, and this works. Surprising.
Even when Grozny fell, the Chechens simply began a protracted guerrilla war in the countryside. The Chechen president at the time was Zakhar Dadayev, a veteran of the Soviet-Afghan War who knew exactly how to counter the Federation offensives, while much of the field actions were organized by a military officer and hardline Muslim extremist named Shamil Basayev, who had close ties with the Mujahideen. Though guilty of blatant acts of terrorism against the Russian people, Basayev would go on to serve as the chairman of Chechnya after Yeltsin was forced to sign the Ksav-Yurt Accords in 1996. These accords brought hostilities to an end, but left the status of Chechnya in a gray area that both sides knew would only cause future conflict. 1996 was...
I don't know if I'll talk about this, but I think this is the war. Maybe it's the second one. Either the second or the first. I believe it was the first because I got a peace agreement out of it. This is the Chechens took a theater full of Russians. Russian Spetsnaz used gas and to incapacitate everyone. And yeah, a whole bunch of people died because of it because they wouldn't give the antidote. There's a whole bunch of shit. But yeah, they gassed the fuck out of everyone, the hostage and the enemy. So when they went in there, they just basically had to tap everyone because they're all knocked out. And most of a lot of hostages didn't make it.
Was also,
and the whole reason they did that was to get a peace agreement in the First Chechen War, and I don't know the whole story about that one. So.
An election year in Russia, and thanks to the bungled war effort, the increasingly unpopular and unhealthy Boris Yeltsin urgently needed support against his political rivals. Enter Vladimir Putin, an unassuming former KGB agent brought on to assist Yeltsin's campaign. For the next...
An unassuming KGB agent. It's like a fucking oxymoron is what that is.
7 months, the powerful Moscow oligarchs savaged each other in the political arena while Putin discreetly toiled in the background. In 1997, a successfully re-elected Yeltsin promoted him to chief of the main control directorate of the Presidential Property Management Department and deputy chief of the presidential staff. This gave Putin wide-reaching authority to investigate government corruption, which he prosecuted with a selective diligence that always conveniently benefited the Yeltsin administration. The connections he forged via these investigations would earn him many friends and equally as many enemies, and were instrumental in his appointment to the directorship of the Federal Security Service in 1998 and the office of Prime Minister in August 1999 after Yeltsin fired his previous prime minister and entire political cabinet for the 4th time.
I believe the president of Russia is the head of state and the prime minister is the head of government. I'm not totally not totally positive on the Russian government system. But usually, the prime minister is actually above the president in most Western-ish European countries. However, president of Russia, which is... Putin basically makes it whatever the fuck he wanted to. So.
But while Putin was busy amassing power with Yeltsin's presidency, Shamil Basayev was plotting to destroy it. On August 7th, Basayev and fellow Muslim extremist Ibn el-Khattab led a 1,400-strong Islamist insurgency into the neighboring Republic of Dagestan, intending to establish a new Chechen Dagestan Islamic Republic. Putin used the conflict to divert attention away from his increasingly noisy whistleblowers and vocal critics within the Russian government. Having already begun emerging from Yeltsin's shadow, Putin now asked the president for absolute power to coordinate the Russian response to Dagestan. Yeltsin and the rest of the Russian Duma agreed, and Putin threw himself into proving that the Russian Federation still had its teeth. Within a month, the dream of an Islamic Republic had been trampled into the dust by the boots of nearly 20,000 Russian soldiers, backed up by artillery, airstrikes, and even a small number of shiny new T-90 main battle tanks. But just as war seemed to be wrapping up early in September...
Also the Russian Duma is the Congress. It's basically their legislative body.
A series of explosions rocked apartment complexes across Moscow and Volgodonsk. Putin had intelligence assets in Chechnya, and these swiftly blamed Ebna el-Khattab for the deaths of at least 293 innocent Russian civilians. The explosions also outraged the nation, and this spirit of righteous indignation was expertly channeled by Putin's rhetoric at the time, and his popularity skyrocketed when he began aggressively calling for retribution against Chechnya.
The same thing happened after 9/11 with Bush. If anybody was alive, I was alive, couldn't remember shit, but his popularity after the 9/11 attacks were damn near 90%, and almost damn near 95%, so.
The issue was that the president of Chechnya, Aslan Maskadov, was absolutely desperate to avoid another war. In August, Russian planes had entered Chechen airspace and bombed retreating mujahideen, but Maskadov refused to retaliate. While Putin prepared to attack, Maskadov was practically screaming his desire to negotiate from the nearest rooftop, going so far as to repeatedly try to telephone Yeltsin personally, only to be ignored at every turn.
That sounds a hell of a lot like World War I with Serbia being like, yeah, we agree to literally every single demand, except maybe one, and we want some just help from the international community. And Austria-Hungary's like, fuck that, die!
Of course, absolutely none of this mattered to Putin, and on the 30th of September, 90,000 Russian soldiers thundered across the border into northern Chechnya, now led by experienced veterans of the First Chechen War. The Russians reacted to urban guerrilla warfare by simply flattening every piece of available cover with gratuitous amounts of artillery fire and airstrikes.
Literally. They said, fine, if you want to use it, because in the First Chechen War, they used apartment blocks with RPGs at the top to shoot into the tops of the tanks, and the tops of the tanks get hit. There's literally no armor there. It goes through, and since it's a T series tank, T-72, T-64, whatever, they have a carousel autoloader on the bottom, right? When that gets hit from the top and there's nothing to stop it, boop, 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 fucking turret goes boom, every single crew member dies, turret flies off. So, they wanted to avoid that. What do? Blow the ever-living shit out of whatever you fought. So when Ukraine is happening, and it still is happening, I was surprised that there was still a city left at all, because this is the usual tactic that they've learned from Chechnya, which is just blow the shit out of everything. And what are they going to use?
The local Chechen village elders were politely told to expel any rebels and submit to occupation, or have their settlements declared terrorist bases and subsequently bombed to rubble.
We politely ask you to either follow us or be annihilated.
Early November, the Russians were advancing across the Terek River, straight towards Grozny, to surround it and blast the defenders into submission with overwhelming firepower. On the 12th, Gudermes, the second largest city in Chechnya, fell to the Russian advance, and just a few weeks later, the first troops reached the outskirts of Grozny and began the siege.
There is video of this. There are videos of the amount of artillery that was used here. Absolutely flattened this whole city. I don't even think it got rebuilt today. Like, the amount of damage that was done, it blew everything up, basically.
Over the next 2 months, Grozny was subjected to constant bombardment, while Russian troops secured strategic positions in the suburbs and skirmished with their Chechen counterparts, who often tried disguising themselves in Russian uniforms during nighttime raids. In early December, the nearby city of Argun fell after significant resistance that left several hundred Russians dead or wounded. With its capture, Grozny was surrounded, and the real attack could begin.
They're also still using, if I remember, in the First War, they just used basically all Soviet equipment. And in the Second War, they basically still had only Soviet equipment, because all this equipment here, this is all Soviet-era stuff, basically.
The Russian plan of attack involved dividing Grozny into 15 sectors, reconnoitered one by one to identify enemy strongholds. These would then be subjected to long-range bombardment before sappers created safe corridors for infantry to secure the sector. The bulk of the...
And this is... instead of driving into the city like they did the first time. So again, recon, blow other positions. Engineers, safe for the infantry, so infantry can start moving. And you divide it into sectors like this so you can easily take it over. So there's a very methodical plan behind this.
To secure the sector. The bulk of the street fighting would be done by loyalist Chechen militia under the command of a former mayor of Grozny, Bislan Gantamirov. Backing up the militia were 2 MVD brigades and several units of the feared Russian Special Forces operatives, the Spetsnaz.
Okay, so MVD is a security apparatus that is used in the Russian Federation currently. It's not exactly the KGB. Protect Diplomatic Corps. I don't exactly know the full details, but just know it's kind of like a CIA kind of FSB. I won't even say it's kind of like a CIA thing. It's his own unique thing. And when they say Russian Spetsnaz, that's just a fucking general term. If they're gonna say Spetsnaz, they should have just said Special Forces, because that's basically what it fucking means, or Special Detachment. They don't even specifically have to be Special Forces. It can be Special Detachment. Now, when you are referring to like elite Special Forces, usually like Alpha Group, those guys are what we would assume. Spetsnaz, Special Forces, Alpha Group, some of the best guys that Russia has in their Special Forces. There's a whole bunch of different Special Forces that they have. But Spetsnaz is just, that's like saying Special Forces were sent into Afghanistan by the United States. Who is that? Are those Navy SEALs? Are those Rangers? Are those Green Berets? Are those Night Stalkers? Who do you mean?
Was intended to reduce the mobility of Chechen defenders and create a spiderweb of Russian-controlled areas throughout the city. After this web had been woven around Grozny, storm detachments of 30 to 50 men would break up pockets of serious resistance, while the militia would mop up the stragglers.
These storm detachments, I'm assuming they call their heritage back to World War II, with the Soviets using submachine gun platoons. Literally just think of platoons and companies, and I believe battalions, of literally nothing but guys armed with submachine guns. So in this case, I mean, everyone has AK-47, but the tactics are the same. You throw grenades, you're very violent in your action, you clear the building out.
Each detachment also had access to sniper rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, and the terrifying Shmel RPO-A flamethrower. On the 24th of December, the first Russian soldiers advanced into Grozny, escorted closely by tanks and backed up by BMP infantry fighting vehicles that also acted as field ambulances.
I'll get back to that part in a minute, but I just want you guys to look. This is it would be even more diversified than this. There was no real standardized fucking shit. Because again, Russia was broke at this time, and they're just using whatever Soviet gear. Some of them had the old Soviet Union sickle belts that they're still wearing. Some of them took them off. It's a very mishmash of equipment.
Vehicles that also acted as field ambulances.
And that makes sense. APCs being used as field ambulances like this, advancing behind the tanks, it makes sense. I mean, you can't evacuate a casualty, really, if you're under fire. And in an ambulance, you put all the medical supplies in it and set it behind the line a little bit, and there you go.
With so much firepower at their disposal, the Russians avoided close combat whenever possible, instead marking clusters of resistance for elimination by mortar and artillery barrages. The first reports of the battle to reach the Russian media were glowingly positive, describing the occupation of huge swaths of Grozny and virtually no direct confrontations with the enemy. But in reality, the fighting was vicious, hectic, and extremely intense. Guerrilla fighters were constantly sneaking past the siege lines to reinforce their comrades in the city, and were far more numerous and determined than expected. The Chechen militia complained they were left unsupported during engagements, and the Russian troops often failed to adequately secure sectors before moving on, resulting in territory captured one day being lost the next day. You
can see, again, the Russian army at this time, it's not today. It's getting their ass beat by Ukraine and the rest of the world sending them equipment. And back then, no money, no training,
Day. The worst fighting occurred in January of the new year, as both sides grappled for control over Minutka Square, surrounded by 5 to 9-story buildings that made ideal positioning for snipers.
Why don't you just take a look at this? Just imagine you're a Russian soldier. Look how many windows and little holes and crevices a sniper could be behind to shoot you. Okay? Hundreds, thousands. Every single one of these. Remember, the city wouldn't even look like this. It was turning dust, right? So there would be like a little like think of your wall, you punch a little hole out, and then you could sit behind that wall, punch out, right? Sit behind it, put it far back. Doing a horrible explanation of this, but basically, if you punch a hole in the wall and then you sit back behind it far enough away where you can see through it, but they can't actually see you, you can shoot through those little tiny holes. Again, this is just sniper paradise. It was hell for infantry.
Long-range duels were interspersed by frantic close-quarters combat as Chechens used tunnels and hidden crawl spaces to infiltrate Russian lines. The tallest building in Grozny was also located near the square and changed hands multiple times throughout the month. But
And I should mention, it takes a hell of a lot to bring these buildings down. All these are concrete, thanks to the Soviet Union. These are all concrete. Again, Soviet Union had to get a lot of people housed after World War II, and these people were living in medieval houses, and they got a massive upgrade. And these things today, to our eyes, might seem like real bad, but it was a massive living standard increase from literally a medieval house to this. So they thought it was like, wow, this is so big. I've read accounts of people being like, "What? This bathroom is the size of our entire house," or it's just yeah. So it's incredible what the Soviet Union, because they're making the mass production of these basically stone concrete things. So.
But while Chechen control over Grozny was slowly eroding, Putin's control over the Russian government had become absolute. After nearly a decade of struggling with severe alcoholism and heart disease, Yeltsin had decided not to stand for re-election in the year 2000. But Yeltsin was in a conundrum, as the office of president was the only thing protecting him from the vast horde of extremely rich enemies he had acquired. In late 1999, Yeltsin summoned Putin to his private residence and made a deal. In exchange for resigning and letting Putin become the acting president for the rest of his term, Putin would grant Yeltsin immunity from prosecution when he left the office. Yeltsin resigned on New Year's Eve, and that very evening, Putin traveled to Dagestan and made speeches affirming his commitment to the war effort, including the quote, "This is not just about restoring Russia's honor and dignity, it's about putting an end to the breakup of the Russian Federation."
Prevent the breakup of the Soviet Union. Again, you can see all of the beginnings of Putin here being like, why does he win the war of Ukraine? All of this stuff. He wants Ukraine back in the Russian Federation, which wants to reform the Russian Empire, more or less. If you actually read his arguments, and yeah, wants to restore the glory of Russia, the Empire of Russia, with Finland under it, and Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, all of Ukraine, you know.
Their resolve strengthened by the knowledge that they were now led by a relatively young, healthy, and highly energetic leader instead of the aging, sickly, and horribly unpopular Yeltsin. Russian troops continued to push into the Chechen capital. By January, Grozny had earned the highly prestigious title of the most battle-damaged city since the Second World War, with vast sections having been utterly obliterated by weeks of Russian shelling. Early January saw the fiercest fighting yet, as the Chechen rebels mounted a last-ditch counteroffensive that saw guerrillas popping up behind enemy lines in Argun, Gundermes, and Shali. By this point, Russian paranoia was at an all-time high, and there are many allegations of Federation soldiers indiscriminately murdering civilians to root out disguised insurgents, or simply out of sheer frustration at the continued Chechen defiance. Just as it became clear Grozny was a lost cause, Shamil Basayev arrived to personally coordinate a breakout attempt through the vast Russian minefield encircling the city. On the 29th, Basayev and his officers led the way through the mines, marking the way for their beleaguered subordinates.
Technically, I think mines are against war. According to the UN, according to the fact that you have to sign a declaration of war, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, getting through a fucking minefield, you don't want to be the one doing it, I'll put it that way.
Though many were wounded, the majority were able to escape, leaving the capital once again in the hands of the invaders. But this retreat infuriated Muskadev, who had hoped to negotiate with the Russian officials while Grozny still held. To make matters worse, many survivors of the battle crossed the border into neutral Georgia, which the Russians cheerfully used as an excuse to conduct airstrikes into Georgian territory. This sent a clear message to other nations in the Caucasus, demonstrating that Putin would not tolerate even passive cooperation with Chechnya, dashing Muscatev's hopes of forming a coalition in the region.
Yeah, basically, if you get involved, we will bomb the shit out of you. Turkey, NATO ally. They're in this region, but they're not in this region, if you get what I'm saying. They're a bit far, but Georgia and Armenia and Azerbaijan, yeah, they're in this fucking region. And it makes sense. Basically, they're trying to prevent what happened in Afghanistan, which is Afghanistanis would walk the fuck across the Pakistani border because they're Pashtun, and the U.S. couldn't bomb them, couldn't send troops. Secretly, we could do whatever, but you can't just launch a fucking massive campaign against them right there, right? Because they just keep walking back and forth and just supplying, and it's just bullshit, right? To every Afghan veteran I've talked to, fucking bullshit what they did there. But yeah, walk across the border and you're fine, right? And they come back with hundreds of guns and go back over to Pakistan and train and then come back over. So
forming a coalition in the region. Even the Americans cynically exploited the situation for their own benefit, making a great show of offering aid to the innocent Georgians, while paying lip service at best to Chechnya. Alone, isolated, and forced to rely on wanted terrorists for the defense of his country, Muscatov was in an untenable situation. His every attempt at peace talks were sabotaged by Muslim radicals, and the legitimacy of his government had been forever tainted by his association with men like Basayev and El-Khattab. Having seized the capital, the Russian army now spread out into the countryside to conduct mopping-up operations. Most remaining pockets of opposition were holed up in the mountainous regions in the south of the country, such as Shatoy and Vidino.
And this was absolutely bloody fighting for the Russians. Absolutely. It was Afghanistan turned up before Afghanistan, really. And Afghanistan happens in 2001, really. Is when we get our first troops in there. So this is happening in 1999, 2000. So yeah, they live in the mountains. This is their home. Really hard to root them out.
But even the largest of these consisted of a few hundred men at most, and their ability to resist amounted to acts of sabotage and terrorism designed to make life as annoying for the occupiers as possible. While the Chechen insurgency clung to the faint hope of victory, Vladimir Putin was being sworn in as president of the Russian Federation. His policies in Chechnya had been carefully spun by the media as the actions of a man determined to weld the various fragmentary parts of the Union back into a united, cohesive whole. Thanks to this, Putin secured an easy 53% of the popular vote. Just 2 months after his
That's actually a closer election than I thought it would be.
Victory, Putin placed Chechnya under direct rule, with a hand-picked pro-Russian government taking office in the blasted ruins of Grozny. But the real government of Chechnya persisted, with Muscatov continuing to try and represent his nation to the best of his abilities while in exile. However, his credibility would be constantly sabotaged, particularly by the events of 9/11. Almost as soon as the attack occurred, Putin called President Bush, ostensibly to express condolences, but also taking the time to imply a link between the Chechen resistance and Al-Qaeda. By planting such seeds of doubt, Putin was able to keep international pressure off of Russia while leaving the Chechen government isolated.
Yeah, global war on terrorism. If you can convince the rest of them, because after 9/11, be like, yeah, these people are Muslim, they're fighting us, and they have some ties to Al-Qaeda. Baba da boopy, green light from America. Do whatever the fuck you want, but we got a war to fight, so.
Muscatov's last gasp came in 2002, when El-Khattab was assassinated by a poisoned letter. By far the most extreme member of the Chechen resistance, El-Khattab's death indirectly gave Muscatov the political capital needed to bring the eternally bickering Chechen guerrillas together one last time.
The poison letters thing, you may be like, how constant of a threat that is. Every single Congress letter has to go through scanning. If you send a letter to your congressman, they have to scan it, they have to read it, because they've had threats like sarin gas on these things. Sarin gas, to be a thing, if you get sarin in on your skin, you will die in minutes. So yeah, poison letters are a real thing.
Naturally, Basayev chose this exact moment to claim responsibility for a hostage-taking at the Nordost Theater in Moscow.
Ah, so it was the Second Chechen War that this happened in.
Since he was still commander-in-chief of Chechnya's armed forces, this extremely public link to a terrorist attack that resulted in hundreds of innocent deaths destroyed Muscatev's dream of negotiation once and for all. Basayev would leave the Chechen government.
I believe there was actually a female terrorist that was also a part of this. So yeah, I believe this is, and she was a suicide bomber, if I remember correctly.
Negotiation once and for all. Basayev would leave the Chechen government shortly thereafter, but not before him and Muscatev publicly denounced each other as Russian double agents. 2002 was also the year the Russian army handed over combat duties against the insurgents to locally appointed militia groups made up of Chechen loyalists. In October of 2003, the Chechen government installed by Russian-elected Akhmad Kadyrov as president. Kadyrov oversaw a referendum on the constitution, which included a motion to reintegrate with the Russian Federation. Debate over the wording.
And this guy is, let me talk about it for a minute.
Of the constitution was forbidden, and over 80,000 Russian soldiers were also allowed to vote, rendering the proceedings farcical. To further emphasize just how little power the puppet government had, Kadyrov was killed in an explosion at Grozny Stadium in 2004, and the Kremlin reacted by putting his son, Ramzan, through an emergency political education as his father's eventual successor.
And that dude is still, yeah, so his dad was killed in this theater, okay? And this theater has been, if I remember correctly, he hosts like a fucking show parade here every year. And this is his son. And his son is still president, whatever, of Chechnya. And he's a playboy and he has absolute power in the region. I'm not talking like, oh, I have a little power. No. He has absolute power in this region and can do whatever he wants. He's basically playing king. I mean, it's a dynasty, for God's sake. His dad was it and then he has it. So just a dynasty down there with him in charge.
Ramzan through an emergency political education as his father's eventual successor. 2004 also saw Aslan Muscatev's death, as he was tracked down by Russian special forces and killed by a grenade blast. Shamil Basayev would last until 2006, when he too met an explosive end by accidentally triggering a mine while attempting to disarm it.
That is why the first priority in EOD is to get everyone away and blow the device up if you can, because you don't want to be fucking with it, because there's a likely chance that something could go wrong and then you will blow yourself up. The only time EOD is going to be like, we can't do that, is if it's like at a city center and it's a very important thing that they have to go try to disarm. Otherwise, they'll just blow the fucking thing up.
For various reasons, it is impossible to definitively determine when the Second Chechen War came to an end. Remnants of the insurgency continue operating to this day, and fragments of the Ichkeria government still cling to legitimacy in secluded corners of the Caucasus. However, most place the end of the conventional conflict as occurring shortly after the fall of Grozny, while anti-terrorist operations continued into the late 2000s. It is estimated that to this date, around 7,000 Russians have been killed in combat with insurgents, in exchange for around 16,000 Chechen casualties. The civilian toll is up to 10 times higher, with both sides accused of extensive war crimes against innocents, and acts of terrorism by Chechen extremists having killed at least 600 Russians outside the borders of Chechnya itself.
So, very good video. Yeah. So, that's the Second Chechen War. Hope you found my reaction entertaining. Up there should be a playlist for the Armchair Historian to my reactions. If you want to go check that out. Otherwise, please like and subscribe. And again, you can go check the original video in the description if you would like to do that. Otherwise, I will see you people next time. See you later.